All right, the overhead press checklist for massive or huge delts. It is undeniable by now that overhead press is probably the most important factor for developing big fuck off, unnatural looking natty delts. So I'm not going to go over why the overhead press is so important. I'm sure you guys know that by now. What I'm more looking to do is talk about how to optimize this movement in order to get the most out of it. Because for the longest time, I didn't really get much out of overhead pressing and I just thought it was an overrated movement. It wasn't until I unlocked a few checklist keys was I able to then make significant gains from the overhead press. So let's go over these potential errors or things that you're not considering for the overhead press that will allow you to get massive delts and a big, strong overhead press. So the first one is simply perhaps less frequency. We have a tendency in exercise to spam things that just aren't working, and it's kind of an oxymoron. And one of the biggest problems with overhead press is the front delt, being the main mover of the overhead press, is indirectly stimulated by a bunch of other exercises we're doing throughout the week. You're doing incline dumbbell presses, barbell presses, presses in general that aren't necessarily overhead presses are still going to indirectly stimulate the front delt to quite some degree. In my case, a lot, because I don't personally feel my chest that much. I'm delt dominant. So when you take that in consideration, you have to understand that you probably need a little bit more rest and a little bit less to get more out of your overhead pressing work. For years, I would spam overhead presses. I'd do 2 to 3 sessions a week of volume overhead presses, and I was stuck at 60 kilos for like 2.5 years. I just gave up at the overhead press. I thought this shit just doesn't work, for me at least. It wasn't until I started doing once a week overhead presses that I start significantly seeing massive changes to my strength and size. Which then kind of leads me to the next point, which is also less volume. Same boat. You can't train it with the same volume as you train muscles that don't hit, indirect stimulus from other days. You can train your quads with more frequency and volume because there's no indirect stimulus from training a bench press on your quads, unless you're doing like crazy leg drive or something. So I found that when I switched to 1 set to failure, rather than, 4 sets of reps in reserve 2 to 3 times a week, my overhead press skyrocketed. It went up from 60 kilos that it was stuck at for years, albeit in calorie surpluses. Everything else was growing, the overhead press wasn't. To 90 kilos in 3 months. 3 months bulking, I went up 30 kilos on my overhead press. Miraculous? No. It just simply needed more rest and recovery and less volume. And more intensity, really. It just needed more stimulus to make an adaptative response versus reps in reserve that just wasn't quite enough for my delts to grow. And I found this to ring true with many, many anecdotal granted people that I've talked to that do high intensity training, is one of the things that grew the biggest and quickest was their delts. Generally, when you switch to high intensity, a lot of times you will see better results than you have before on other muscle parts, but the delts specifically, people have found huge results. And I've found that naturals who do high intensity training have significantly bigger delts than naturals who do retrospective volume work. And I think there is sort of a gatekeeping stereotype that naturals can't get huge delts because they're not on steroids. And one of the only ways to get huge delts, those big unnatural 3D cap delts, is if you're on gear. Partially, yes, because your androgen profile goes up significantly when you're in gear and can bind to the excessive receptors that are in the delts and traps and neck, etc. But I don't buy this narrative. I genuinely think natties can get some pretty freakishly big delts that look unnatural by just simply getting the overhead press stronger with less volume. So that's another big part, was just simply training with significantly less volume, going in once a week, one all-out set to failure, maybe a drop set or 2 here beyond failure, maybe some force reps if you'd like, or rest pauses, and just keeping it stupid simple and making it so that you're definitely recovered and giving yourself enough stimulus to actually make adaptations. The next point is a second variation of the overhead press, perhaps even a third. So this is just to simply keep progression fresh. If you keep on spamming the exact same variation of exercise every single week, you're likely going to stall out slower, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Progressive overload doesn't just stay linear forever. You do slow down. But I found personally that if I would cycle between a seated barbell overhead press and then a dumbbell overhead press the next week, by the time I go back to the barbell press the week coming, I would have fresh gains. I would have gains that was significantly faster as far as progressive overload goes than had I just kept trying to spam that one variation. because we are now training the biological or adhering to the biological law of accommodation, where just doing the exact same thing over and over and over again ceases to give your body a reason to adapt. And if I had, say, a Smith machine, in order to totally just eliminate technical prowess requirements, which is something I'll get to in a second, I would probably put that third variation in too. I'm limited to just barbells and dumbbells, but that was plenty enough for me. And then on top of that, who's to say that one of those variations isn't slightly superior to the other one, unbeknownst to me? Yes, when I do a barbell overhead press and a dumbbell overhead press, I virtually feel no difference. Sometimes I felt like the dumbbell overhead press might have been giving me more stimulus, but realistically, without like an EMG study or some other ways of ascertaining which one was superior, I'd rather just do both in order to make sure that I'm not losing out on gains from a potentially superior variation. Obviously, I could just do one for 6 months and see if I get better gains from that one than the other. A lot of noise here, a lot of gray area, and then obviously I start to stall out quicker because of the biological law of accommodation. I'd rather just do 2 of these variations, where one might be inferior mildly and the other one might be superior, mildly, and thus I can make maybe more gains. It also just keeps it fresh and fun. I don't personally like doing the exact same exercises every single week personally, so I like that variation of switching up movements and then by proxy of that, getting the benefits of progressively overloading faster. The next point is that smaller muscles require smaller progressions. Yes, the overhead press is a compound movement, but it isn't as compound as, say, a deadlift or a bench press. A deadlift, you're using 5, 6, potentially 7 different large muscle groups in unison, and thus you could very well progress 5, 10 kilos perhaps a week, or 10, 15 pounds a week for you Americans. But overhead press, yes, it is compound. Yes, there are numerous muscles working, but they're smaller. The triceps and front delts aren't anywhere as big as the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the glutes, the spinal erectors, all in combination. So people will try to progress the overhead press 2.5, 5 kilos a session. This isn't necessarily always feasible. You might need to progressively overload through the rep range first, then progress, say, a kilo at a time. Now, personally, by implementing the last 3 points that I've mentioned, I was able to progress pretty decently quickly than I was doing volume, but still won't be able to progress it as fast as a very large compound movement. And if you do, you're going to stall out quickly and you're going to then regress. It is better to add 1 kilo once a week over a 52-week yearly program and add 52 kilos to your overhead press than it is to try and add 10 kilos in a month, but then stall out and not be able to keep progressing and get central nervous system fatigue and then just confusion and basically be demoralized in your programming. That's a huge factor here. So slow progress, maximum a kilo or 2.5 kilos at a time. Progress through the rep ranges first. Start at 8, work your way up to 12, progress maybe a kilo, maybe 2.5, depending on how fast your progress is going. Personally, my last bulk, I was able to add 2.5 kilos every time I got up to the 12 rep margin or 10 rep margin. I was doing 6 to 10 reps, but I still progress through the reps first. You can't just keep loading plates every single session unless you're like on anabolics or you're bulking up 5 kilos a week or something ludicrous. So smaller progressions for smaller muscles. So the next point is less technical, more gains. So what I mean by this is one of the problems with the standing overhead press is the technical requirements for it. If you're new, there's going to be a learning curve before you can get intense or significantly put your muscles under load because you're trying to learn the technique first. Very technical movement. There's a lot to think about. Core stability, bar path, elbows being tucked under, all these different little nuances that go into the overhead press. Even someone that's been lifting for years can be falsely regressing or progressing depending on whether or not their technique is better from a day-to-day or a set-to-set basis. The amount of times that I would one week get 5 reps on an overhead press and be chuffed, and then the next week I'd only get 3, even though everything else in my life was progressing. Every other lift was progressing. I was undeniably in a calorie surplus. I would get like 2 or 3 reps the next week and go, what the fuck happened? Well, the technique was less efficient, and you can't have every single rep as technically efficient as possible. This is why I don't like Olympic lifts, because they're just going to be varied from week to week depending on your technical prowess. Overhead press is very technical. On top of that, it is harder to keep strict. The amount of times I've had clients where I have to say, hey, Stop using leg drive. Hey, stop using your abs just to contract the abs a little bit to overhead press to get that extra rep. That can make all the difference. If you use even just an inch of leg drive in an overhead press, it can mean the difference between 5 reps strict and 10 reps with a slight little push of the ankles, because the legs are very strong muscles. And then if you're using abs or some other way of cheating the form, you are going to get more or less reps and less tension on the muscles based off that fact. So personally, I much prefer keeping it less technical and more honest by just simply doing a seated overhead press. Not only when you sit can you just more so focus on the muscles that you're trying to contract versus the technical requirements, thinking about squeezing your abs, making sure you're not using leg drive, making sure you're doing this, not doing that. That will take away from your ability just to think about, am I squeezing my delts really good? Yes, good. Am I getting a good mind-muscle connection? Great. Am I cheating? No, because you're seated. You can't cheat a seated overhead press, or it'd be very difficult too. So more technical allows more gains. You can have consistent reps, more consistent progressions or potentially regressions, and that way you know if you're regressing, there is something wrong with your training rather than just something wrong with your form. So when you can, I would highly suggest sitting down on the overhead press. The powerlifters and strong dudes and power builders are going to be like, oh, you're a sissy, stand up and do it, a full body compound movement. That's cool if you're worrying about like maximal strength, but when it comes to just trying to get honestly strong and bigger, you're much better off sitting down and removing as much technical prowess as possible. Ideally, use a Smith machine. Make it as standardized as humanly possible and as delt dominant as humanly possible. The less stabilization required, the less technical prowess required, the more you're going to be able to isolate the delts rather than, stabilizing with your pecs, stabilizing with your triceps, grip, core, etc. Next point is full range of motion. I mean, this ties into the technical or the standardization aspect where if you are going from the chin level, which I see a lot of people do with the overhead press, one rep you might go an inch lower than last time and you'll think you've gotten weaker, or you'll miss that rep, or you'll go an inch higher this session and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I progressively overloaded. No, you just simply went an inch higher. An inch can make all the difference in your strength on a movement. It is vastly superior. Go all the way down to your clavicle bone and all the way overhead to make sure that every rep is exactly the same and you know that you're progressively overloading honestly, because progressive overload outside of intensity is the most important aspect of hypertrophy and just getting strong in general, especially as a natural. So make sure you're doing a full range of motion. On top of that, when you go all the way down, you get more of a stretch in the front delt. You get more stimulus from the front delt rather than doing, these half reps that are far more tricep dominant. It's vastly superior to standardize it and activate more muscle fibers. Next point is calorie surplus. Now, this is a no-brainer probably, but if you don't know by now, the overhead press and bench press and pressing movements in general, for numerous reasons, suffer heavily if you're not in a surplus. It's very hard to gain strength and size in pressing muscles if you are not in a surplus. Leg muscles, back muscles, a little bit easier to gain muscle in a deficit as long as you're not too advanced. But by now, you should know that you'll gain far more strength across the board if you're in a surplus than if you're in a maintenance or deficit, but especially to pressing movements. Now, in saying this, a caveat is I gained about 12 kilos of strength to my overhead press in a deficit. I lost 20 kilos of weight and gained 12 kilos to my overhead press. From a novice to intermediate standard, mind you, I wasn't a beginner either. I went from a 60 kilo overhead press to about 72 kilo overhead press in the span of about a year or two whilst cutting weight. Granted, it wasn't until I then went into a surplus that I gained 17 kilos of strength to my overhead press in like a fraction of the time. So yes, you can gain strength to the overhead press if you're in a deficit or maintenance, especially if you are a beginner or novice, maybe even intermediate, but it's not going to be as obvious. It's not going to be as profound. So it should be in a calorie surplus if you're looking to gain significant strength and size to your delts from the overhead press. Last point is just simply rep range. I thought I would cover this. Rep ranges aren't that big of a deal, although I think there is some nuance to this. Personally, when I do significantly heavier loads like 4 to 6 rep overhead presses, I don't feel my delts engage as much, and that's pretty standard of lower rep ranges. It's harder to feel the muscles on those lower reps versus higher reps where there's more lactic acid and you have more time to develop waste products and just feel the muscles. But in general, I find that the happy medium for me and many people is 6 to 10 reps. It's heavy, but it's high enough reps that you can still feel a decent burn in the muscles and feel the muscles activate versus heavier reps, I personally find muscles, especially if you are tricep or pec dominant, will take over way more versus higher reps where you can really engage the muscles you're trying to target. You could do 8 to 12 too. I personally don't like 8 to 12 on the overhead press. I just like that happy medium. 6 to 10, that worked great for me. Allowed me to feel the muscles while still simultaneously using some seriously heavy poundages. And something about 6 to 10 it just allowed me to progressively overload quicker. My form would break down a little bit quicker on 4 to 6. I wasn't able to progressively overload as quick on 4 to 6 for whatever reason. I don't exactly know why. 6 to 10 was the happy medium, but again, it's personal. For you, it could be 10 to 15. Maybe you have shoulder injuries and you need less weight. Maybe you just don't feel your shoulders much in general, so you need more waste products and lactic acid in order to really feel them activate. Maybe you prefer heavier overhead presses. Maybe you like really heavy 4 to 6 rep range overhead presses. It's personal, but try different rep ranges, see what ones work for you. Personally, I like 6 for 10. I think most people 6 to 10 works really well. Try that to start. If you don't like it, go heavier. If you don't like that, go lighter. Just see what works for you. Because again, it is personal experience. You have to take pieces of information and be your own science experiment. Take logical pieces of information like I've given you here today, weed out the shit, weed out the good stuff that works for you, apply it, see if it works. If it doesn't work, then so be it. Good chance it will. And that's it for today. That's my overhead press checklist for huge delts. I think if you at least apply a few of these, you're going to see significantly better gains to your overhead press. Anyway, until next time, bye-bye.